to you in a couple of minutes with a little bit more detail on that, but I've got a few housekeeping matters, safety and well-being comments that I need to make. While I'm doing that, if any of you who are down the back in the really good seats would like to move forward into business class, you're more than welcome to move while I'm making the health and safety comments. So for those of you who need it, the facilities are directly behind this room, out the door and round to the right, and they're there both here, this level, and downstairs. The emergency exits are as identified on the sides of the room, and should we need to have an emergency exit, those of you going out this way to the rear will be the car park for your point of gathering, and out the front will be the grass verge on the street. We do have first aid facilities here, and for those of you who get really stressed, there is a defibrillator as well, so hopefully we won't need to use it, but we do have them here for need if necessary. So please sit back and relax and enjoy this evening. It's here to inform you, it's here to allow us to discuss, it's here to allow us to get your views as well as for us to share with you a little bit more about this project. So back to my own involvement. I used to live in Palmerston North many years ago. Went to Massey, spent many years here, and I currently chair the Waste Advisory Group, the project steering group that looks at this whole process and taking it through. I've got a background in water and wastewater treatment. I've got a background in local government and corporate affairs. So it's really good to be involved here with a great team to work through this project and actually give us as a city a facility that will meet our environmental requirements, our fiscal requirements, but also leave us with a city that takes us forward with something that we're proud of and an environment that we and our families will want to live in. We have with us tonight the councillors, and His Worship the Mayor will introduce the councillors directly when he comes up to speak. We also have a Chief Executive, Heather. Good to have you here, and a large number of the executive team. This is an important project. Everybody's committed to actually being part of that team. So I'm going to now pass over to the Mayor and let him make some comments, and then I will introduce each of our other speakers as we go through the evening. Your Worship.
Thank you, David. Kia ora, everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight. And welcome to our Nature Calls wastewater project and the best practical option, the BPO process. I'd just like to introduce some of our councillors. Councillor Zolfika Butt, Councillor Brent Barrett, Councillor Bruno Petrinas, Councillor Rachel Bowen, Councillor Leonie Harpiter, Councillor Susan Beatty, Councillor Renee Dingwell, and Councillor Karen Naylor. Forgot to tell me about the technology. Right, we have action. So look, Nature Calls and its history. Wastewater, well, first of all, you would have got one of these in your mailbox, and that's really why you are here. This document that outlined the BPO process, what we're talking about in terms of options, and where we go to from here. So wastewater is everything that literally goes down your drain in your home. Shower, the dishwasher, washing machine, sink, and of course the toilet. And it comes to our treatment plant where we treat it and discharge it. And under the Resource Management Act, we need to have a resource consent for this. Our current consent was granted in 2003 for 25 years, and in 2013 Horizons raised concerns about some of the impacts on wastewater on the Manawatu River. we agreed to bring this consent application forward into 2022, 8 years early, and that got both the councils out of court and spending millions of dollars, but without a cent being spent on the river. We need to put a new consent application in by mid-2022. And that's what this project is about, determining how we should do this for the future, how we should start working on the consent application, which will take about 18 months. So the project team was established in 2017 and began working around investigating various options. The governance team meet monthly, and that's chaired by an independent chair and David, and the officers and the consultants continually work on the project every week. The steering group has been established to help guide the work, and this group involves council officers, elected members, iwi and the project team. And scientists have been engaged from the beginning to start working on the technical information that we need to make an informed decision. So the wastewater cost itself. Currently residents pay $253 a year for everything that's associated with collecting, treating and discharging wastewater. And this is actually the most economical targeted wastewater rate in the country. And I'll show some cities that are close by to us or of a similar size. And there's some on the screen there just to give you an option from ourselves right to those in the 700s. But each city will have different amounts based on their population size, the level of treatment, and the sensitivity to the receiving environment. The more residents to share this cost, the cheaper it becomes. Costs will also depend on how recently communities have had to renew their consents and for the treating and discharging of wastewater. And Palmerston North City is obviously one of only a few cities that are landlocked, where the majority of cities have ocean discharges. I think around 70% of them do. And I just want to add that all communities will experience increasing costs when renewing their wastewater consents due to the much stricter environmental compliance requirements. We've said that these options would increase rates between $300 to $900 per property per year, and that is based on a number of assumptions, including the potential interest rates for the loan. A significant contribution would also come from our trade waste customers, and any rating impact wouldn't come into effect for at least a couple of years. And the council would need to borrow the full capital cost of the project, then fund the debt servicing and repayment over the life of the expected consent, and that would be around 30 years. The additional charge will be borne by residents and trade waste users that had access to the network. The average interest rate for loans raised and refinanced throughout the 30 years is assumed to be 3.5%. There will be reductions in the present costs for treatment and disposal once the plant is commissioned, as it's assumed that this amount will be around $2.4 million a year, and there will be an additional saving of $1.2 million a year, which is the amount that is being spent each year to investigate and determine this option process that we're in now. This is still related to this screen, madam. There will be an operating and maintenance costs that will vary for each of the options being considered. And with options involving land, there will be potential opportunities of growing something on that land, like trees or a cut and carry operation to raise funds. And these are income streams that several other TAs, Taupo and Rotorua, have explored in the past. So before this project started in 2017, a placeholder budget of $128.8 million was set aside in our 10-year plan for a new wastewater solution. We were aware that this project was coming for some time, and it had featured in 2 past 10-year plans. In both plans, it was stated that there was a significant risk that this funding amount allowed may not be sufficient. Environmental standards and expectations have increased greatly, and the scope and the cost has also increased greatly. To give you an example, when I first became the mayor 5 years ago, we had a range of options and different costs associated, and it varied from the $30 million projects right out to the 128, but it became apparent very quickly that the 128 was where we were heading. So I want to stress that our financial strategy and policy is to borrow for large infrastructure projects such as this because it's intergenerational and interest rates are cheap. We couldn't just save $500 million, and there is a reference, there has been a reference that a lot of people are making that why are we continuing with some other projects, i.e. projects like Arena or our city streetscape. And I emphasise that we do need to prioritise in the coming LTP, but these projects that effectively are a $17 million project and a $1.2 million project, not doing them simply won't impact on this larger project. The Arena Master Plan, it's been a 30-year project on Council's books, and it's also an economic enabler for the city. Speedway, for instance, brings over $26 million per annum alone to the city. In the Square Streets for People project, again another project which has been on LTPs for some years, has a whole lot of underground infrastructure associated with it, as well as urgent need of renewals for footpaths, and also has an economic effect for us in the middle of the CBD. But I do want to emphasise that we do need to prioritise, and the beauty about having master plans and LTPs, long-term plans, is they can be turned on and turned off. I just want to cover off overall city rates. And each city determines its rates differently. Some have equalisation, some have targeted rates, some have uniform charges, some have a combination of all, some have levies. So Palmerston North City's rates are moderate compared to others within New Zealand, and the average cost is around between $2,500 and $2,600. And by comparison, you can see some costs of other cities around us, and we've got the extreme from Auckland down to others that are closer to us around the Manawatu and Kapiti region. But generally the level of service determines what rates are, and in Palmerston North they are generally very high. I just want to repeat, this is not an optional project. We are legally required to obtain a new resource consent, so these costs will be factored into long-term planning for our city. We're exploring government, external and industry funding, and these conversations will continue. The challenge is to determine the most cost-effective option that strikes a balance and appropriately between the environment, cultural, social and financial considerations. And any rate impact will not come into effect for a couple of years. Our stakeholder discussions have been ongoing. We've been having conversations with the Manawatu and Horowhenua district councils, and a range of experts have been involved, including public health. Our local iwi rangatane had been right in at the start at the steering group, and during the consultation period we've also been talking to other iwi in the Manawatu and Horowhenua. We've been keeping our consenting authority, Horizons Regional Council, regularly updated. The government is making a number of changes around water as well, and the 3 waters, which are freshwater, wastewater and stormwater, they are looking at setting up an agency, an aggregated agency. And they've been doing a review of the management of the 3 waters. And they've also signalled a government regulator. There is the possibility of a regional agency being established to take responsibility for water services in our wider region, but it is likely to be some time away. Council is involved in these discussions around a possible regional agency, but despite this, we do need to continue with the progress we're making on the current wastewater consent process. So I will be around later on to answer any questions, and I'll now pass it back to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. So the Mayor has set the scene, given us an overview, provided some context of where it fits within the overall plan for the city and the relative requirements for capital expenditure and our own living environment. So we're now going to go through into a slightly more detailed conversation. First of all, Mike's going to come and talk to us from the waste treatment, water treatment operator's point of view to tell us exactly what's happening now, just so that everybody's on the same page. And then we'll get Robert and Milena to come and talk us through the process we've got through to where we are now, and how those options sit and where they fit. Just so that you know what happens after that, once you've got the context, so the Mayor's set, if you like, the citywide context, Mike will give us the what's happening now position. Rob and Milena will say where we're sitting in terms of what options sit before us going forward. We'll then have a question time. And this will allow you, with that sort of holistic picture of where we're at, to raise the questions that you want. And to help you think about your questions, what we'd like to do is perhaps spend the first 15 minutes or so of questions, depending on the level of questions we have. We'll focus on the options, so you can actually think through what the options are, what you like, what you don't like, what you're not sure of. You can get some more clarity around the options. The second set of questions will talk about money, because everybody's interested in that. And the third set of questions will talk about the environment, because on all of these things we're playing off a whole series of different criteria and influencing factors. How much money do we want to spend? What sort of environment do we want to live in? What kind of cultural outcomes do we want? Where does it fit in terms of the last option that we'll look at in terms of sustainability? What are we looking at in terms of the carbon footprint? What are we looking about in terms of waste disposal at the end? What are the overall impacts on that? Can we generate energy from the process, and so on? So there are, if you like, four main categories of questions, and that's simply to help us get focused. We can have some general questions at the end, and as the Mayor said, he's here, the executive team are here. We're more than happy to help work through the questions. At the end, we'll remind you about making submissions and our desire to have your input, your views, to feed into the process so we can consider them as part of the next steps in going through to getting to a best practical option and a consenting process. Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak tonight. I really just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the current treatment plant, what's at Trotter Road, how it works, things like that. And I thought it'd be easier if we watched a very short video clip to save me doing all the talking, but then I remembered it's me talking on the video clip anyway, so you still get to listen to me. So if we can just roll that clip, that'd be great. When you hear the word wastewater, you probably think of this, your toilet, and all the stuff that goes down it. But wastewater is actually anything that goes down a drain in your home, from sinks to bathtubs to showers, your washing machine, and even those incinerators. Once you remove the plug or turn off the tap, that stuff travels through a network of 420 kilometres of pipes, and it arrives here at our wastewater treatment plant in Awapuni. It comes in here. The first step is to remove all the things that shouldn't be in there. Things like wet wipes, plastics, even condoms and tampons, false teeth and credit cards. These all get sent up a conveyor and go straight in the bin. The wastewater is then pumped with air to help remove any grit or sand. It is then pumped to to our sedimentation tanks, any remaining solid material sinks to the bottom, while the cleaner water flows out of the end. By this stage, about 60% of the solid material has been removed. Remember, this isn't just poos. It could be fat, oil, or even tiny scraps of food from your sink. These large lagoons are a vital next step in our treatment process. Air is pumped into the water to provide oxygen, which allows microorganisms to grow. They then eat the remaining material. This whole process is natural and doesn't involve any chemicals. Over here, we're removing the phosphorus from the water. Phosphorus can have disastrous effects on our waterways, so we need to do all we can to remove it. That's hard though, when it's in so many things, like the food we eat, but also in fertilizers and a number of cleaning products, like dishwash and laundry powder. It looks like clean water now, right? It's not though, it still has germs in it that we want to get rid of. We blast the water with UV light, and this reduces the germs by 10,000 times. By now we've removed 99.9% of the bacteria. The final step is to release the water into these wetlands. The wetlands are a cultural addition to our plant, where the water flows across land before being released into the Manitou River. From the moment you flush to when it leaves the plant is roughly 4 days. There is one more step in the wastewater process though. Remember that sludge that's sunk to the bottom of those sedimentation tanks? We hold it in these digesters for about 20 days. Bacteria help to break it down before it's removed off site. So you can see it's quite a complex process treating wastewater. All I wanted to talk about this evening really was 4 key points, and that's the 4 key functions of a wastewater treatment plant. So the first of those functions, as you saw in the video, is the removal of any products that shouldn't be in the wastewater to start with. You know, we've not had dinner yet, and it's that time of the night that I'm not going to go into real detail here, but you can get the points. Things that are flushed that shouldn't be flushed. The key message is the 3 Ps. You've probably heard this before: pee, poo, and paper, and we're just talking about toilet paper there. The second key function of the plant is to reduce carbon. As you know, carbon is a building block of life. It's present in the food we eat, the carbohydrates, proteins, fats, etc. And some of this carbon is used by our bodies for growth and is converted to energy. But there's also a lot of carbon left in the discharge that we don't use, and that inevitably ends up at the wastewater treatment plant through fecal waste, through fecal matter, things like that. So the plant's main purpose is the reduction of that carbon, and that's done through the primary and the secondary treatment stages, and it's largely a biological process. We rely on large numbers of bacteria to grow to utilise that carbon for their growth and ultimately to reduce that carbon through the plant. The third key function of the plant is the reduction of nutrients, and there'll be a lot talked about nutrients tonight. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the key nutrients that we're interested in wastewater treatment. The Trotter Road treatment plant does an exceptional job of removing phosphorus down to very low levels, typically around about 0.15 parts per million, which is a high-performing plant. The current consent does not require us to remove nitrogen from the plant, but it does require us to monitor and measure the impact of the nitrogen in the receiving environment. And the fourth key function that I wish to talk about is the reduction of harmful pathogens. So we have a UV, that's ultraviolet light, disinfection process, and that reduces the number of harmful bacteria that is reduced into our receiving environment. The current treatment plant at Trotter Road was built in 1968, and it's been through a number of major upgrades. The first was in 1985, where we extended the plant and built aerated lagoons. And as you saw on the video, that's to reduce that carbon content in the form of BOD and suspended solids. The plant then had a significant improvement in 2003, and that was to meet the current condition, the new operating consent conditions. A tertiary treatment plant was built. Its main function was to build a chemical-dosed phosphorus removal process, a UV disinfection plant, a new wetland, and a new river outfall. That's really all I wanted to talk about, just to emphasize how the current treatment plant works, how it operates. It works well and operates well against its current consent conditions. And I think I'll hand over now to...
It's the wastewater treatment plant.
think, yeah. Do you want me to sort of talk to that now, or Robert, do you want to talk to that?
So the short answer is the current plant won't meet the consenting requirements we will have to meet in 5 years' time. So it meets the current requirements, and so we're all okay today, but we won't be okay in a couple of years' time because it won't meet the requirements. And we need to do the planning now to make sure that we can build something that meets the requirements when the consent comes through.
35 years.
Yes.
If we live that long, why not? Why do it now and instead of spreading it over 35 years?
Because, can we answer that question when we come to do the end? So the short answer is we're doing this. So one of the really interesting things, if I can just put it into context, is that this exercise is actually a credit to the city's planners, because they're actually planning for what needs to be done in the future so that you're actually ready to do it when it has to be done, not waiting till you've actually got a problem and then having to do it retrospectively under pressure. So there's actually a good planning process, and it's a very responsible way of actually managing this whole program. And it lets you see what's coming down the turnpike, to use the phrase. So from a practical point of view, it's important that we understand that, and His Worship said this isn't going to affect rates tomorrow. It's giving an idea of what the issues are going to be going forward, depending on which options we take in the future, which leads me into the options. So Robert and Elena are going to talk to us about the 6 options that have come through, how we got to there and what those options are. Robert's the infrastructure manager, Elena's the project manager. They both have a history in water and wastewater treatment. They're technically very competent in the whole process of planning, consenting and the technical aspects of it. Ideally placed, the city's lucky to have them, and I'm going to hand over to you to do, I won't say a Laurel and Hardy show, but we'll get the 2 of you to do the presentations. Thanks very much.
Hello everybody. Some of you may have seen me on the video at the beginning. It was really hard to watch myself on TV, so I'm glad I'm standing up here now. I think it would be really valuable just to set some context around how we've got to this point, why we've got 6 options here in front of you. Over the past few years, we've been leading a process of understanding what will our wastewater look like in 35 years' time. So what does our growth and development look like? What technology do we have now at hand and what's coming up that we can utilise to come up with an option that basically will minimise effects on the environment, the RMA requirement that we need to meet in a couple of years' time. So I don't have a pretty funnel, but it's a really good way to visualise this if you're a visual person. We're going through a funnel in order to get to this preferred BPO option. We originally started with 36 options, which looked at anything from evaporation to air, treating it so high that it goes back into the water supply, similar to what happens in Singapore. And then we looked at what receiving environments we have here that were more traditional for wastewater disposal, so back into the river as we're doing at the moment, to land, to groundwater in different ways, or out to the coast, and then a hybrid of such. So originally we started with 36 options that we felt we could evaluate and identify if there were any fatal flaws. So the fatal flaw sits at the top of the funnel. At that stage we took out 10 options which are absolutely unconsentable or culturally unacceptable, completely unaffordable. When I say unaffordable, I'm talking billions of dollars options. So at the moment we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, but we got rid of the $2 billion options. Hopefully you agree with those ones. We then narrowed it down to 26. So at 26, we did a far more robust analysis, but still at a conceptual level with technical consultants involved. The consultants are experts in their area, and when we took on board technical consultants a few years ago, we did do a bit of hand-picking with expertise in wastewater, river science, for example, who have local experience, as well as international. So we're working with a firm that can bring in technology and advancements for overseas, which is a valuable thing for Palmy. The traffic light assessment, which was the thing that basically got us down to 6 options, was where we had our technical people all in a room along with key stakeholders, including Rangatane. We involved Environment Network 1 or 2. We opened the door to others. where we were able to actually debate all of the options based on the different expertise in the room where we got to the 6. Where we're heading is we've still got another assessment process to go through, and the information that we get out of this consultation is really important, and as David mentioned earlier, for the council to understand where the aspirations sit, where there are issues, and it's a learning process for us as much as it is for you guys through this. We will be doing an MCA, which is a multi-criteria analysis. Engineers love them, but it is a good tool, and it's an assessment tool, it's not a decision-making tool, to get to a preferred option. And there's a lot of work that's still underway at the moment for us to be able to do that. By December this year, we'll be aiming to have the BPO, which is the preferred option, and then we've got a whole year of doing assessments before we lodge in June 2022. These are the project objectives which are used through the whole process. So when I talked about the funnel and we had the fatal flaw and the traffic light, etc., how we're assessing these are born off these objectives, which were set back in 2017. So you can see from these there is a range of assessments here around public health. We've got environmental effects, particular focus on river health. That is in the consent condition which was imposed in the review phase, where we've got to maintain the health of the river, in fact improve the health of the river. But with that said, the options we're looking at, adverse effects need to be avoided. There's always one. Social and community values and aspirations has also been assessed. Cultural effects, financial implications and risks, technology and innovation. Now that applies to all of the options, and once we do have a preferred one, there'll be further steps taken to identify how can we treat to those higher standards and what is being done overseas, for example. Resilience, so natural hazards and climate change is throughout this whole process, and the impact or potential changes from growth and development. And that's not just growth and development and catering for what the city needs as a service for wastewater, but it's also about what does that potential effect have on the city growing? So are we taking land for areas that could otherwise be used for growth and development? Now I'm not going to go into any technical level of detail on this. I will say just before I get into briefly describing each of the options and passing over to Robert, who's going to talk about trade waste and sustainability, that we are looking at providing more information on these so that you get a really, hopefully, a balanced view of some of the environmental, social effects with each of the option that we understand at this stage. We still have a journey to go in doing the detailed assessment of effects on whatever option it ends up being. So option 1 is similar to business as usual, as in it's going to the river, continuing at Trotter Road, but a far higher level of treatment. So we're looking at, while we do phosphorus at the moment, we need to get the nitrogen levels down. And we're working closely with Rangatane around what wetlands and land passages may look like for this particular option. So what we have at the moment was born out of the previous consent process, but in terms of maintaining high quality water at the point of discharge and into the river, we do need to make some changes. So again, that's another package of work that we have underway at the moment, which is working across all options, so not just this one in particular. Option 2, which this is all referenced in your little book, we're looking at still higher treatment levels, but we're splitting the discharge between Trotter Road, where we're at the moment, and out to Opiki with some land application, which is the smallest portion of land application out of all the options now. Oh, sorry. Thought I was on a good roll there. Now, with the 2 discharge locations, the reason why we're looking at a proportion going down to Opiki is that the conditions in the river change. They become sandy, which is less sensitive than what we've got at Trotter Road at the moment. There are environmental science work consultants involved with evaluating that at the moment, and we are in the stage of trying to establish what does it mean from a treatment perspective, and what time of the year would we be able to discharge without adverse effects on the river. So the focus is river health in this option, and in option 1 in particular. So that refinement's still underway. Option 3, 97% to land. The 3% is because there are going to be periods where the river is exceptionally high and likely to have soils that are saturated, so therefore we've got to have that contingency in there of the 3%. This is the largest portion of land we require in 2,500 to 3,500 hectares. So to visualise, that's our urban footprint of Palmerston North, somewhere in the Manawatu region. We are looking at areas that are either fluvial soils, which is your farming type country, and then out to the coast where it's better draining in the sandy soils. So better soil drainage, less land, you're looking at 2,500 hectares. Less soakable soils, not so good, 3,500. Option 4, we're looking at a proportion of treated to land and back into the river. The split's around 70-30 or 60-40, depending on how we can manage that. And then the land is around 1,250 to 2,000 hectares. And what I will say about these land-based options is that with a large area like 3,500 hectares, we're probably unable to fit that within Palmerston North's jurisdiction. So it's likely to go somewhere either in Horowhenua or Manawatu district. And we are all conceptualising this. We haven't picked a site. 5 is to groundwater, and in that option, oh, I've lost my page. A lot less, but we do need to explore where there are sites that don't have potable water supplies. Groundwater is a big resource here in this region, particularly for the farming areas. And we have, and I will mention that we have had initial conversations to understand if there is a desire to take treated wastewater for irrigation. It's a bit hit and miss. We have had feedback that it could work, but when it's in the food chain, it's also a cultural issue and it's a public perception issue. So those are debates that are out there at the moment. And then the last option we've got is the coastal option, which is less land, and we haven't, as I said, put a line in the sand in terms of where that would go. Bad analogy, but there's a lot of infrastructure required for this option. You can see that the costs are quite high. We have had conversations with neighbouring councils about is there the opportunity for a regional scheme. We've still got to progress this option, so we can't, for the BPO. There's the risk of us not applying for the BPO in order to wait for a more regional scheme is probably not on the cards. 2 k's off the coast, so we don't have an outfall at the shoreline. It'll be buried below the sand, 2 k's out. There are cultural issues with this. We understand that the coast is a recreational area, but at the same time, the ability to treat and discharge wastewater out there has slightly less environmental impact than the other options because the level would be treated high enough. So part of the consent, and I've already touched on this, we do need to undertake a really tight and robust assessment of effects that will involve the consultants we've had right from the beginning. So in terms of investing on more time, we're doing a lot of work now in order to have a really robust application and hopefully minimise the time that we're sitting either getting it processed or in the Environment Court, which for our neighbouring councils have spent a lot of money on in the last 5 years, having to get the options over the line. I've already touched on the fact that we've got overseas knowledge involved in the project team, which is highly valuable. This process that we're doing now with consultation is going to help inform us. We do need to understand what the social community aspirations are in order to do the evaluation. We haven't made that decision yet on what the preferred option is, so this is a valued process. And I'm going to hand you over to Robert now, who's going to just touch on trade waste.
Thanks, Milena. Look, I'm conscious we've been talking at you a while, so it won't be too long. You've heard a bit about the options to treat and discharge wastewater once they arrive at the treatment plant. Of course, at the same time, we need to be going, and the council's looking to go up the pipe. So how can we influence the volumes and the types of wastewater that are actually arriving at our treatment plant? So there are probably 3 key areas I want to just touch on briefly with you. So the first is clearly we have a majority of our wastewater is residential or domestic in nature, coming from household properties or from businesses in town. But there is a reasonably significant portion of wastewater which comes from our trade-based customers. So currently there's around 500 businesses who typically fall into the definition of trade waste. Now, the majority of those would be small operations, typically restaurants, who produce domestic type wastewater, although slightly stronger. So there's only a small number, 23, that we have what we would call significant volumes and strength wastewater. And we're actively working with those customers not only to understand the nature of their discharges, but also the range of contaminants, and work with them to look at opportunities to actually reduce those flows and those loads, but also identify the best options for pre-treatment, so we can receive less into the network. Currently, they pay around $1 million. Typically, they're about 20% of the flow that we receive on an average day, and anything up to 30% of the sort of contaminant loads. So, as I say, we're engaging with them as a special group through this process, so we can help them understand the potential impacts of these options and costs. So, the other key challenge for the wastewater treatment plant is, of course, when it rains, there are quite a lot of places in the network which are open to stormwater. So we have cracks in pipes, we have places in the network, but also we have private properties where over time the stormwater from downpipes has become directed to the wastewater system. So we can see anything from sort of 4 to 6 times increase in the flow rate that arrives at our treatment plant. So clearly that volumetric change, impacts on any future treatment plant sizing, any potential area of land that we might acquire. So one of the parallel pieces of work we're looking to do is look to see if we can identify the worst of those locations and work proactively with you as householders and customers, to eliminate that where possible. And we will never solve or resolve all of that, but we hope that we will at least stop the problem from getting worse and maybe deal with some of the worst of those catchments. And then I suppose the third area really is about engaging with you and the wider community around how we can influence the volumes of wastewater that we create in our own households and businesses. So, at the moment, typically most properties, most individuals are using about 200 odd plus litres a day in water. But we're also, we're obviously, using water with all the other activities that occur in the house. Some of you will have one of those awful pieces of equipment called a garbage grinder, in your kitchen, which is a way of converting very good composting material into a waste and sending it to the wastewater treatment plant. So, we've reviewed a whole lot of the technologies that are available, everything from composting toilets to grey water reuse, to these sorts of appliances. And we're trying to understand how we might influence both the availability and the use of those sorts of technologies to reduce the wastewater volumes, but also the strengths of wastewater. And some of those levers, some of those incentives, you might see come up in terms of council's initiatives through this project. So I suppose what we're, certainly there's a few pointers there on the slide about the sorts of things that we shouldn't be putting down the sink or down the toilet, but equally we want to work proactively to incentivise, the best new technology in terms of new house builds, low water use fittings and fixtures. Generally we're now buying, more modern appliances, so we are seeing, general reductions in some of those waste flows. So, those are some of the things where we're looking at up the pipe, in addition to the options around the treatment and disposal. So that's pretty much us. So I think we're open for questions now.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Milena. Well done to the presenters. A great good show. Thanks very much. Right, we're open to questions now, and we had one question earlier about why are we doing this now, given the time frames. And I could answer that, but I'm going to throw it to Robert to actually work backwards from when we actually need the plant, when we have to have the consent, why we're doing it now, and the construction time frames, to sort of put it into context.
Yes, the history of wastewater treatment in New Zealand has almost been a series of cycles. So, if you go back enough in time, you'll find that there were no wastewater networks. People had their own cesspits and, septic tank systems. And as cities developed, they built networks, and then they had pipelines, and a lot of them would have discharged to the local river. Then we've had cycles of treatment and upgrade over the years. So what is typically driving those key points of change is legislative and community changing expectations. So those trends have been now captured in a consenting process, which is now managed by regional councils. So the last time we received consent for the treatment plant was 2003, and at that time we received a 25-year permit or consent for that treatment plant. So we would have had to have renewed that consent in 2028. However, partway through that process, as regional councils do, they want to check how well our treatment plant is doing. Is it meeting the community expectations? Is it meeting the consent conditions? And during that review process, as Worship mentioned, that we were challenged about the effect that the city's discharge was having, and as a result of that process, the council agreed to bring forward the date by which they would apply for a new or a renewal of that consent. So that date now is the end of June 2022. So at that date, we must lodge a new set of, as it were, a new application, and we must now demonstrate through that application how we are going to meet the new community aspirations, the new environmental regulations that are now apply. So typically, each time you do that, there's a lift in the level of performance. So we're essentially assessing that environment, which we're going to be encountering in 2022, and determining which option will be the best practicable option. So we hope the maximum period you can currently get a permit or consents for is 35 years. So we hope that when we do lodge in 2022 and through the process that follows, we'll secure a 35-year consent. It will take a few years for that process to occur, the hearings to occur, and the consenting process. So we would expect not to know about a final decision before probably 2024, 2025. So at that point, we would begin constructing or implementing the new scheme. Yeah.
So if I can just add, we are required to know how we are going to meet the consent when we apply for the consent. So that's why the design and the detail of how the plant is going to work, we've got to be able to show with a level of rigour that what we're proposing will meet the new proposed consenting requirements to meet the environmental effects that are deemed required. So that's why all this design work's being done now, so that when you lodge in 22, we actually have a design that we know will work and that is affordable and deliverable, so it's a real thing for the consenting process to go through. So that's 22, allow a couple of years to get the consent if it's challenged, if it has to go to the Environment Court and so on, take that through to 24, and then you've got 3 or 4 years to actually do the construction, because by 28 it has to be functional and operational because there's no consenting after that. So we would be violating any discharge requirement. So that's the time frame, and it's got some buffers in it to work our way through. Just to put some context and personalise Robert's comments about the changes in time, and I'm now going to show you how old I am. When I was at university here at Massey, doing studies in water and wastewater treatment in the early 70s, we studied the Palmerston North waste treatment plant because it was state-of-the-art at the time, and we had international visitors coming here talking about it. So that puts the context, and you've got to remember that Palmerston was a lot smaller then. So the requirements on the river have gone up, their volumes have gone up, the level of intensity of industry has gone up, and that's why all of these things have to change over time. It's not static. So we're now going to look at the options. questions from the floor on the 6 options or the process to get to the options, or even something we forgot about in terms of the options, we're happy to take questions. If you put your hand up, there's one down here, there's a roving microphone, you'll be given the microphone and you can just address the question and go from there. And there's another one, gentleman down by the corridor there next to.
Thank you very much. I suppose my question is for Melaine. You presented 6 options. I don't pretend that I fully understood all of them, but how certain are you that any of the 6 options first will deliver the goal that we are trying to achieve? So when you present 6 options, are you saying that they all will deliver a better Manawatu River in once we start implementing them?
Yeah.
That was the first part of my question.
Okay, yes. So the 6 options we've put forward all could be consented, provided we achieve a treatment level that minimise adverse effects on the environment.
And I'm pretty sure you've got substantial evidence to back what you just said.
We have, at a conceptual level, so to make this an affordable process too, we haven't done every option to the end design because that would be lengthy and costly. So what we've done is sufficient information in order to do an evaluation process, and then we're going to continue to get more and more information as we go through this next 6 months of evaluating, and then once we have the preferred option, that's when we get into the real detail about what is the level of effect and applying for that. We have removed the unconsentable, well, what we believe are the unconsentable options from all the perspectives I described earlier.
Thank you. Now, the other bit is, did the council, probably this question is not for you, Melaine, but has the council actually, or for whomsoever can actually answer it, has the council looked at other similar cities in the developed world and, you know, came back with a recommendation on exactly what they do?
Yeah, so thanks, Adam. I mean, yeah, we've looked at numerous other cities, bearing in mind that we're building a little bit for the future as well. So as David said, you know...
In which countries, Your Worship?
Oh, look, we've looked everywhere. I mean, we've had a look at Singapore. We even had some water from Singapore that was, you know, basically grey water that came back, and I even drank it. So it's certainly can be done in terms of recycling the water. But in terms of New Zealand and Australasia, we've had people from America here as well. But it's just understanding what is achievable and what is the best practical option for this city.
Now, the third question, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, you're cheating a little, but you can't have more than 3.
All right, final one. Melaine has mentioned, well, the 6th option is about discharging to sea. And while we're doing that, there could be, this project could lay the foundation for other cities to benefit from, and for a start of a regional work rather than Palmerston North on its own fitting the bill. And because of what you said, that could possibly be the highest cost option. But it's like, is there any other cities that are actually can roll up their sleeves and work with us to make sure that the best option becomes a reality, and sharing the cost with us rather than us fitting the bill? I don't know who would answer this question.
You want to shoot it?
Yeah, I mentioned in there that we about 2 years ago actually, we went to the neighbouring councils to say we're doing this process. Manawatu, for example, have already got consent, and they've got a next stage of their consent in order to get out of the river. We proposed to them, is there an opportunity? We haven't had buy-in as such, but it was definitely a solution that we were putting forward. I don't know if you want to put anything else into that, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, the other councils are fairly well advanced with some of their own planning. So Horowhenua looked like essentially having all of their discharges largely going to land. So they have not indicated any interest in sharing an ocean outfall at this stage. Rangitiki do have plans for looking at piping, I think, Martin and Bull's wastewater to the ocean. So yes, there is a possibility maybe of a shared solution. But yeah, we're leaving that door open, but no firm indication at this stage. No.
Central government, Your Worship?
Yeah, definitely. And just to back Robert up, we've tried to talk to all the TAs around us, and a lot of them do small plants too, because of the nature of the makeup of their districts. So we're the only one that has everything that comes to us, like Bunnythorpe comes here, Ashurst comes here, the trade waste, which Robert spoke about. So there's one discharge rather than multiple discharges, which is what happens around us. So yes, the future is definitely being discussed. It's hard to get other TAs though to commit to coming in. I talked about the government aggregated model. That will be interesting to see where government wants to take that discussion. If they decide to go down an aggregated where everybody does come together, then I'm not saying it'll be forced, but there'll be a stick and carrot approach. And that's something that we are definitely at the forefront of the discussion on.
So can I add a couple of other points here just in context? So that conversation in principle is also being held with commercial entities, so they will help fund it. It'll also allow them to consolidate with our waste treatment facilities as going forward if we can negotiate suitable terms and an efficient operation. So the issue is that the city's looking at all of the waste options, privately funded factories and operations as well as local authorities, to see how that works. Your question about international best practice, the technical advisors are an international firm, so they're bringing international best practice in as part of the selection process, and a number of us work internationally as well. So we're doing that. We have access to, for an example, direct access to the senior people in Sydney Water, where they've got a whole series of options on waste treatment, and they're available to us at any stage to help in the process. So we're actually using all of those connections to optimise our outcome. The gentleman in the blue jersey, and then there was a lady at the back. You got the next microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first comment is about this booklet. How far has it been distributed? I was talking to some friends who live in Whitmore Road. They have not seen this book. You're asking us to put in submissions by the 30th of June, which is less than 2 weeks. How many of these booklets have been distributed? This is a huge project, and I'm disappointed that she may only get 10%. And I don't believe you can make a major decision involving hundreds of millions of dollars if you only get a 10% response from the people.
Thank you.
So Trevor, could I answer? So thank you, Trevor, for your question. So first of all, it was distributed to every rateable property, but I understand 10% have missed it, so we've got about 90% there.
Yeah, and look, I understand your frustration there, and we have anticipated the distribution issues that might occur with this booklet being delivered to households, not least because 15% of our households have no circulars, please. Yeah. And the second one, obviously, is that people don't necessarily look at all the brochures and things in their letter boxes, but also I myself was a newspaper boy back in the day, and occasionally the odd box would go missing and didn't end up in people's letter boxes. So based on that, we've anticipated that in our planning, hence evenings like this where you can pick up the booklet. We've had 3 weeks of promotion across radio and press and also online. You can call our call centre. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we will personally drop off a brochure to you, and that has actually occurred. I think we've had tens of households that we've actually personally delivered a brochure to, and I do hope you take the opportunity to pick up one tonight.
Thank you. Just one other question. Have there been cost and benefit analysis done on the 6 options you're putting forward?
The cost-benefit analysis is going to be the next stage, so this is starting to go through the options. We know roughly what the costs are, we know what the treatment is, and we go through what Milena said was a multi-criteria analysis. So what are all the options, what are all the outcomes, what are the costs, how will it be funded, and that will end up bringing us to the best practical option where best looks at value, environment, sustainability and so on. The lady there with, yes, cardigan and
Good evening,
Adam.
everyone. My name's Kristen Huff. Thank you first for taking my questions. So I also have three, since someone else got three. My first question is, do the costs that are presented in here, you talked about the trade waste, 20% flow and 30% contaminant flow, and indicating that those 23 trade wastes that are quite high volume, are those costs in addition to what it costs to the household ratepayer? So is that separate from what is presented here, or would that then reduce this cost in some way? So that's question number one.
Those costs to the householder exclude the trade waste
Thank you.
charges. Yeah.
My question number two is, this is likely in a phase two. It is not directly a cost-benefit analysis aspect, but it is what other indirect costs will be assessed in the same way as if you do not repair roads, you end up with more accidents, so then there are healthcare costs. Is that an aspect of the phase two that will be presented alongside the options so that you understand the costs that are a trade-off?
So I'll answer that. Broadly, the answer is yes, because that's a risk analysis. So as part of the multi-criteria analysis, you will actually look at plant resilience, the capability to handle peak loads, variations that you weren't anticipating. So those will be worked through as part of the options. And then you actually have to decide how much cost you're going to put into that for the potential risks of some of those happening, and so you then do the risk analysis of consequence versus cost versus probability of occurring, without boring you all with the details.
But I might suggest that if you present that data saying, here is the cost to the ratepayer, but in this option we are likely to see X more in healthcare costs and X more paid in this way, that might provide a more holistic approach. And I know it requires a little bit more data visualization, but it could be helpful.
And you're right, and the reason we basically brought it down to 6 that we know are doable is so that you're not doing that on 26 options, which would be catastrophically expensive and confusing. So we brought it down. Now we are going to go to the lady with the purple turtleneck shirt.
Thank you. My concern is about climate change and the amount of energy that will be used both in the construction and the maintenance phases of the different options. Have you looked at it through a climate change lens to see what would be required and what it might cost in terms of carbon?
So that is part of the sustainability component. If you go back to the key criteria that was looked at in terms of the options, then the amount of carbon that's used and how we minimise the amount of carbon and therefore CO2 generated and how we recycle that is part of the climate change. How the energy is used, what energy we need is a key issue, because not only is that a climate issue, it's a cost issue. So we're trying to get a minimum amount of energy through the plant, so that affects the operating costs versus the capital costs. So the sustainability component, of which climate change is a key part, is an integral part of this process of evaluating which is the best option. It's a whole of life analysis. It's not just the cheapest thing to build at the front end.
So at the moment, do you know which options are the best in terms of?
Well, of those, we know those 6 cover the range of the most likely best options that we have done. So we then worked our way down from those 6 down to the best one, and that will be detailed analysis. So perhaps a simple way to look at this for all of us is, it's like if you're building a new home and you've got a bare piece of land. So we're actually going to build a new home. We're not quite sure what the land looks like, whether it's flat or sloping. And so you start getting a whole series of concepts of how you'd like your house to be. And over time you find the land, and then you pick your options, and your detailed design comes out at the end. So we're going through that process in a similar way. So we're not doing all of the detail on 6 options of paying an architect to do 6 sets of plans and building consents. We're waiting till we get to the end. I've got a question right down the back.
Good evening. One of the things that's really come through to me this evening is particularly the language that's being assumed, being used. We assume we assume the interest rates are going to stay low. We assume that this project is going to be viable for 35 years. So we are assuming that we're contributing a very large sum of money to something that could potentially not be there in the 35-year time frame that we're talking about. We're assuming that we're not facing a gigantic financial crisis already, in the fact that we're staring down the barrel of a global recession. And we're assuming that, given the Prime Minister has already said that at a national level we're talking about looking at things like sustainability and growing changes in our ecological impact on the country, we're assuming that there's not going to be changes to the resource consent laws happening within that 35-year time frame that's been put forward. Are we not potentially putting a large sum of money to something that's going to fall over in a very short space of time, cost us a bunch of money, and leave us with this great big bill for something that's completely irrelevant?
You want me to answer that? So, it's a good question, and you can take it as hypothetically as you like. The reality is things will change. That's the only thing you can be sure of that won't change. The second thing is what we're doing is looking at the likelihood and the range of things that will occur. So if you take an easy one like interest rates, we know roughly what the time frames are of what those interest rates are likely to be in the foreseeable future. Some of us are old enough to remember when we were paying 18 and 20% on our mortgage. So we're aware of those things, which is why the council has guidelines around their debt equity ratios and the interest rates relative to rate take and so on. So there's some prudence in those decisions. In terms of the environment, it's the reason why we're using the best science we've got in terms of culture, in terms of climate change, in terms of sustainability. We're using the best information we have now to project what we think will occur in the future and to allow for growth. If that growth substantially changes, the pressure will come on and things will change. So I've spent a number of years in Auckland for my sins. Their growth rate was far higher than was projected. So they got a lot more pressure in having to do things earlier than they thought they would need to do. But that's then addressed by the volume, the scale and the activity. So it is built into the design and the options, but you have to be flexible. And as Robert said, if you go back 20 or 30 years, what was state of the art is now not considered acceptable because things have changed. We've now stepped up science and technology and we've moved on. So in another 30 years, we may have to go through it again, but the plant will be ready for another change by then. Sir,
sorry, David,
down here.
Yes, Bruce Cully, ratepayer of Palmerston North.
Olivia?
My question is about the phosphorus removal. Now, there's been a statement made that there's a lot of phosphorus removed, but I understand that at present it is only taken out during low flows of the river. I want to know why it hasn't been taken out all year round. I know it might be expensive, but part of the reason why you've got eutrophication of the river is because phosphorus attaches to silt and clay particles. And when you pull the pin and let all those ponds empty out into the river in high flows, that is what is creating that. And I think whatever process you've got, you're going to have a high phosphorus removal, because I can't see you being allowed to even export a whole lot of phosphorus into the seawater with a sea outfall. And most of your other options have got an option for flow into the river. Now, what are you thinking about that?
No, look, there's very good points made. You're quite correct. At the moment, the chemical phosphorus removal only occurs during the low period of the year. It is a significant cost. I mean, I think runs at around $2,000 a day. So this last summer, we were operating over 5.5 months. So it's a significant portion of the year and a significant cost. You're quite right also that outside of that period, we do not dose, we do not remove phosphorus. And the best science when we originally
obtained our consent was that if you limit phosphorus during the low flow period of the year, that you will constrain the growth of algae within the river. It turns out, as you say, the phosphorus is being deposited, it's being attached within the sediment. So during the low flow period, it isn't limiting. I mean, there's nitrogen in the river, but then the phosphorus is becoming available from the sediment. So we're not getting we're not getting the control on algal growth. So clearly, for the next generation of treatment, we have to control both. We have to limit nitrogen and phosphorus. So in terms of the importance of phosphorus, in terms of the treatment option, it will depend on the receiving environment. So if we are going to land a lot of the time, or most of the time, phosphorus is readily adsorbed to soils and becomes available to plants. So it's less critical then to be removing it from the river discharge. In terms of the ocean environment, can't comment. I mean, clearly there will be effects, and we'll have to look at those as part of that option if that proceeds.
Yeah, but with your land application at times, you're talking about still having to discharge into the river.
We are, yeah.
And you need that phosphate removed for that. And the other thing is you'll actually have more silt and clay particles to pick up the phosphorus below the Opaki Bridge than what you have up this end.
Yeah, again, it comes down to the effect on the environment. So generally, when the river is at higher flow, then we're getting a scuffing or a washing of the algae, we're getting a flushing through the river system. So at that time, the judgment is we can discharge at high levels of phosphorus. So the sensitive period in the river is the low flow period when you have quiescent, clear water conditions. So, yeah.
You'll have problems from the Horowhenua people because they can tell when you've flushed out in high flows.
Thank you. Over here.
We've actually got a question from Facebook, which is, what are the potential drawbacks of choosing the cheapest option versus choosing the best but the more expensive option?
At the moment, we're probably not clear what is the least cost option. So I think that's probably where we're at in the process. But if, as initially seems, that the full discharge to the river, the key drawback, of course, is it doesn't meet the aspirations of the community about removing the discharge from the river. It also means that we continue to discharge some levels of nutrient during the low flow period, which will continue to have an effect, albeit maybe a very small one.
Good evening, everyone. My problem with these 6 options is that they don't go far enough. I'm looking at prevention of that. I don't want the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and I don't want the river polluted any more than it is. I don't want the ocean buggered up. I want to prevent things. And I was looking at things like cleaning up, recycling wastewater, as Singapore has done, avoid any dumping anywhere, encourage and maybe look at water tanks on houses again, making sure Turitea Dam is sustainable, or else beefing that up, and really find the people around us for the stuff they've been dumping in, and they've had 30 years of approval of dumping in Fonterra's crap and pharmaceuticals and such. So until we do something like that, you don't give a damn about the future. You only care about the few bucks you're going to spend over the next 30 or 20 or 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Question right down the back.
Yeah, thank you. I want to tie into a couple of questions that have already been asked. The first point is, I think it's been acknowledged that back in late 90s and early 2000s, the best science said that we could do certain things in certain ways and it would probably be okay. It turned out that it wasn't. So there's a risk that what we do now, or what we decide to do now, turns out to be inadequate in some period of time. And I think that was the point the gentleman over here was making. So in the multi-criteria analysis, will one of the criteria be what is the level of residual risk of whatever is adopted not being able to meet the expectations over the course of the 35 years? The second point is relating to the question about climate change and other things. What weighting will be given to each of the criteria, and how will those weightings be decided? Because you can get any outcome you want by allocating certain weightings to particular criteria. So could those 2 points be addressed, please?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah, you have a go.
Why do I get the hard one? So the first part of your question, sort of the same answer as I gave before, that it's a risk assessment analysis, and obviously anything we do is going to say how much headroom have we got in terms of the design and the process. So what's the headroom relative to the river's assimilative capacity? What's the headroom in the land's assimilative capacity? What's our inflow variation likely to be? Because growth could change in the city, so what's our loading variation? So all of that is fed into to part of the risk assessment. So based on your multi-criteria questions on loading, I'm assuming you've got a fair bit on that. So we actually can do a Monte Carlo analysis that looks at probability versus risk on those multi-criteria variables to try and get a feeling for where the risk surface is and how fast that might change and what the issues are. So there will be some work done around that. The second thing in terms of weighting on the MCA, the multi-criteria analysis, that's part of the variations where you actually have to look at what the weightings would be. So under normal practice, you start with a neutral rating and then you do exactly what you do in terms of even a financial analysis where you look at options, you change the weighting and see how the numbers and the options will change to see if you end up as one of the BPO criteria. One of the most resilient options would be one that still came out as the best option as you change the relative weightings, but that was still seen to be the best option. So that's part of this whole process, which you can't finalise the answer for because you don't want to predetermine what that will be. So, good question. It's part of the process and working through how you analyse that. Question down here right at the front.
Hi, Steve Salisbury, ratepayer. On the back of your booklet, it says, please rank the options in order of your preference. And I guess everyone's got a booklet, so there would be, hopefully, a lot of people ranking their preferences. What concerns me is what you're going to do with that, because, quite honestly, I couldn't rank them because I don't know enough. There's not enough in this booklet for me to say which is, likely the best. Therefore, my question is, what is the point of that question, and can we ensure that it's not overhyped? Because at the end of the day, experts are going to do the analysis that you suggest. They are going to determine, hopefully, which are the best environmental or cost benefits, environmental benefits, and come up with a decision. That's the point. I'd like to be back here having the discussion, because right now it's a bit of a worry.
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll go first, and then you can fill me in. Look, we've had some feedback already about the level of detail that's in, not necessarily the book, but even available online or other ways to get it. So we're in the process now of pulling together more information that we're going to put out, hopefully by the end of this week, but there'll definitely be some word about when it's out. And we're weighing up as well extending so that people have enough time to get an understanding of that information. And we may look at some other forums potentially so that you feel that you can actually ask the questions that you want to ask.
So if I can add one more point to that, and that is part of the basis for the question is that we can spend a lot more time doing the financial, scientific, engineering, detailed analysis on the options. But the social and cultural views is something that requires the community input into. So we're trying to get a feedback from what the community feels they would prefer. Then we're not asking the community to come up with doing the science. We're actually saying we want your views as to what you'd prefer to see, and then the science feeds into that, and then we've got an ability to actually start mixing and matching some of those things together. So it's very early stage on the options, but we start to get a feel as to where we're at, and it also allows us, even if you don't tell us, to tell you the process we're going through, and you'll have some more opportunities as we get closer to the time.
And if I can just comment, I think it may require, because we've had feedback around the environmental side where people wanted a lot more information, that it may require another meeting.
Hi there.
Right down the back again, another question.
Hi there. That's exactly what I was going to ask you about, is the fact that what is the point of this meeting if you don't have the information that we need to make the decisions that you want us to make or give our opinion on? And therefore, when we do have more information, are we going to have another meeting to be able to put forward those options?
I think you've had your answer to that. Lady here.
Mine, funnily enough, was a follow-up or a sideways one to his, and I want to make a point so that you're aware of this. Being me, I went in and looked at the statistics you gave us. I worked out the worst case scenario, what do you call it, the annual lifetime cost, divided it by 35 years. These 6 options go from 8.1 million to 21.5 million. Now, if anyone else has got this book and going to put in a submission, they're going to go for the lowest. Guaranteed. We're all broke. So how does that actually help you? In the sense, for me, I just sat there and thought, oh, bugger it, excuse me. I thought I'll just go for the lowest one but there is another aspect to my question, and that is the environmental thing. You guys would know that the regulatory bill's going through Nana Mahuta's bill, which is in the second reading at the moment. I mean, that's supposed to be out by the December this year. If it goes through, it's been through select committee, it's on second reading, its next ones go to the full house, etc. That's going to have huge implications on this, which is another reason why I think I put on, you'll probably know me from the comments on the forum, but it is why are we pushing this when we've got an new election coming out in a few weeks, that potentially it could change. It's not necessarily going to be a Labour Greens government. It might end up being a national, God knows. You know what But why, isn't this jumping the gun a little bit?
So if I could just answer part of that. So we're part of what the government are talking about, the water regulator, the bill. So we're right at the forefront of that. Hence, a lot of the stuff we're talking about in here, we understand where that may land. And you are right; it's going to get tougher. And I think it will pass. And then another thing is around a lot of the feedback we've got so far, surprisingly, has been for not the cheapest option. So people, I think, are understanding that not diving to the bottom and not necessarily going right up to the top either. But that's a lot of the feedback we've had so far. And around not being able to, we can't delay this, but we will be talking to government the whole way through. We're talking to the regional council, but we do have to, we can't sit and wait. There's absolutely we're just not allowed to.
Question here, and then another one down here.
I just want to suggest that I'm a little concerned because the regional council doesn't enforce the rules that it makes. And we see that in Horowhenua, with Lake Horowhenua, where they're still pouring rubbish into it. I'm a bit concerned that, maybe we're jumping the gun. Maybe we should fix up that part of the process. You have to present to the regional council your plan, and it has to be accepted. And if it is accepted, it's for the next 35 years. But just think back 35 years at our behaviour in regard to climate change. We buried our head in the sand. And that's what we will get again You know, and the excuse we always use is that we can't afford it, it's too dear, it hasn't been worked out properly, you know, a whole lot of things. So please, I'm not here simply to make a statement, but what I really am saying to you, in your consideration and considering what you're doing, think carefully about who enforces it, because goddamn Horizons support and actually almost does nothing.
Thank you for that, and I'm sure Horizons will take that on board. I would also say that collectively we also want to do this because it's the right thing to do, and we actually want to create an environment that our families are happy with. So we're doing this because we want to do it and come up with the best reliable outcome that has some resilience at the lowest practical cost. So it's a case of getting that balance. That's the process we're going through. We don't want to do it simply because there's a stick behind us. Sir?
Yeah, my question's around funding models, in that in a user pay type scenario, so in that the loading on our plants based on the inputs, there is industrial and the infiltration issues, but have, say, funding model of water consumption being based, metering properties and use and water consumption that ends up going down the drain?
Well, Council hasn't at this stage proposed universal water metering, I think is what you're suggesting. But clearly the central government has signalled that as part of moving to a regulator and potentially one authority, it is the neatest and simplest way of holding, obviously, people accountable.
So rural residential properties that are connected to the network are metered. I myself are one. And it's interesting. It's you have a different attitude to what you're doing with water, whereas if you're just paying a uniform charge, it's you're a little bit more wasteful. And also, business definitely pays for it in this city. But at the moment, it's a uniform charge for water.
So a differential price model that would include a rateable part of costing to cover the long-term debt is or could be considered.
It could be, yeah.
So the city isn't going there, but you're talking about global best practice. You all know what happens in the electricity industry, where you have metered use, you have time of day use, you have variable charging. All of those are possible to do with water now and are done around the world in different ways, so that you can actually feed all of those in, which affects the cost of treatment, the cost of operation, the scale of the plant that's needed, etc. So all of those factors are possible, and if I take the Australian situation, most of the cities that I've dealt with in Australia are running 10 to 15% less water use per capita than Palmerston, but you can't just make a direct comparator because most of us live with a house with a garden. A lot of people in Sydney live in an apartment. So where the water's used, how it's used, what water recycling gets incorporated are all a big picture as part of the mix, and Robert addressed that in terms of looking at the upstream issues as well as the downstream issues as to how we manage the process. I think there was a question down the back there.
Thank
Well,
you.
You've had one before, so
I did indeed,
You-
but I only got 2 out of my 3, so thank you. So one of the things that hasn't been addressed that has been coming out in a lot of the Facebook comments, but elsewhere, is we've been through a crisis. I understand we have to do this. This is a long-term thing. This is an infrastructural thing that lasts forever. We need to do that. A lot of people are thinking right now, in the immediacy, we understand it's going to be a 2-year process where we submit the consent and then another 2 years before it gets approved, etc. That means we have 4 years to consider, especially how we might fund this slightly differently. Yes, we have ratepayers, but we have vulnerable communities that are going to be potentially impacted by not just this, but a number of other things over a few years. And I would suggest that that could be something that really needs to be considered in that alternative way of how maybe the other countries developed this. Was it always paid for in this way? I'm not suggesting I don't want to pay that. I'm happy to pay my share. I just think we need to really be considerate of that, considering we don't want a city in which we are a bunch of elitists at the end of the day, frankly.
So the funding and financing stream is a significant part of the process, and what that looks like is completely dependent on what the best practical option might look like, because it'll be completely different structure if we're buying 3,000 hectares of land or we're putting in a very high-tech treatment plant. So that's an important part, and you're absolutely right. And that stream is starting in parallel now with the others.
And so can I just add to that, David, to the lady's question, is government, if you go back some years, Ministry of Works built a lot of the plants, and then, so government were a partner, and we hope that government will be a partner in some way with this new project as well. Also industry, you know, I heard some people saying that, you know, pharmaceuticals are into the river and everything else. Well, actually, that they're into our plant. So we're trying to take the industry discharge with us, so it's treated better. And there's, as Robert said, some up the pipe primary treatment as well. So industry, we hope, will be involved as well. And you know, there's a number of different players in our wider city and surrounds.
Yeah, good evening. Campbell Dodds, 20 years industry professional in the game, and obviously had a fair bit to do way back when the council was undertaking its upgrades back in 2003. Probably a pointed question for Robert is that how hard in your option assessment are you going to look at the preventative measures in terms of going back up the pipe? Because I know the facts in terms of building a plant to handle a wet weather flow of 120,000 cumecs a day as opposed to building something to treat 60,000 cumecs a day, there's a huge difference. And we know how much ingress there is into the system. So, yeah, very direct question in terms of how much emphasis in terms of a ratepayer, because you can get a lot of gains and save a lot of money for building an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, so to speak.
It's a very good question, Cam. There's probably not a community in New Zealand that's still trying to work out how to effectively exclude stormwater from their wastewater network. So I'll be truthful. I don't know how much is the cost-effective investment in trying to exclude stormwater. We have to try and identify those worst catchments, and certainly try to move into the private property space and identify where there are the easy wins, where we can identify stormwater that's going, that can be excluded because it's going into the wrong network. But in reality, we have a pipe network that's ageing. Literally every year we replace less than 0.5% of our pipe network. So clearly, if we're only replacing 0.5%, we can only improve 0.5% in terms of its performance. So we will bring to council some different programs of work, different levels of investment around this program, this opportunity, and you know, they could again add significantly to the investment that we would need to make. But the evidence from other communities that have spent heavily in this space is that it's very hard to bank the reductions, but that doesn't mean we don't need to try. So, yeah, no easy answer. I accept it's a very difficult space.
Yeah, I think given that too, I mean, things like grey water systems are an easy win. We looked at them 20 years ago with the New Zealand Water and Waste Association, and yet in New Zealand we're still well behind the 8 ball. And it's something that councils need to be much more proactive about because it's an easy win.
Thank you for that. And I think Robert didn't say, but there is a lot of work being done modelling the flows in the city, both in dry and wet periods, so you start to pick up where the bigger wins might be if some of that work was done, and that's part of it. Cost-effective analysis on the whole thing.
Yes, my question is sort of related to the last gentleman. and that is we get significant periods of wet weather in the Manawatu where the soils become saturated and farmland becomes saturated and so on. And we've heard tonight that at that same time the flow to the wastewater treatment plant goes up massively. Is discharge to land in those times going to be a viable option? Because if we're getting dramatically increased volumes that parallel the same time when the soil can't absorb it, surely that's a no-go zone.
So that's the two challenges with that. One answer is that's why there's such a large area of land required. And the second one is you'll have noticed that there's never in there that it's absolutely 100%. So there will always be some periods that may not be possible. But that's why the treatment has to be taken into account. But you're absolutely right in terms of the land issues. Some of us started life in agriculture, so we've got a rough idea of the problem there.
He actually asked the same question I was going to ask.
You've had yours answered, have you? Oh, good. At the back, come back to you in a minute, sir.
Hi. Out of the 6 options, based on your technical expertise or your personal opinion, which options do you think is more sustainable in the long run?
I don't think we've yet completed all of the work to establish that, and sustainability is really a balancing of a range of factors. So, I mean, that's the exercise, I suppose, we will be working through with all of not only the experts, but the engagement with the special interest groups and the councillors. So, one person's idea of sustainability might be least long-run cost, other person's might be the maximum environmental benefit. So, I think there is no one answer.
So the sustainable balance has to be the 4 well-beings, if you like, that New Zealand's worked on historically in terms of environment, culture, social and financial, and it's getting that right mix for the long term that is the key driver in this.
And another question I have is, out of these, are all these options able to meet only the minimum requirement for the environmental consent, or will they actually outperform the new environmental consent?
They're all capable of meeting the minimum. In many cases, the options will exceed the minimum for many parameters, but ultimately there will be one limiting factor which you will want to try and optimise. So, and that will be the opportunity, really, I suppose, to manage the cost. So we will acquire as much land as we need to irrigate what we predict will be the maximum volumes. We could always buy more land, but there wouldn't be any point. We will buy just enough, we think, to manage that. We will treat the wastewater to go to the river to meet the most demanding of the parameters. We could possibly treat to a higher standard, but that would be more expensive. So clearly we have to optimise for some limiting parameter within each option here.
Sorry, last question. A very practical question. When are you looking into charging us for this? Is it in 10 years' time, or is it effective in next year?
So there's 2 years to get 2022, June 2022, which David said was when the consent needs to be lodged, and then there'll be approximately 2 years before it is granted, and then there's going to be around 3 years while the plant's being built. So that's your mass.
Yeah, I mean, you are currently paying some money now for this process, all right? I mean, this is costing significant investment from council. And as we get closer to lodging, the costs begin to rise, and then through the consenting process, at some point we'll reach a point where there is an implementation plan, and the moment we start having built things, then obviously the cost will start to land. So, yeah.
All these options seem to be treating
the waste as waste. And I'm just wondering, has there been much consideration into looking at it as a resource?
You know, look, that's a terminology. Absolutely, we already treat the byproducts from our wastewater treatment plant as resource. I mean, we currently, as Mike described in the video, we take the organic solids early in the plant, we treat them in a digester. What he didn't show was we then use the gas from that digester to run a stationary biogas generator. So that electricity then is fed back to the plant to run the plant. The biosolids that we take off from the current plant, they're dried or dewatered, they're mixed with green waste, and they're composted, and they're applied currently to the closed landfill. So, you know, there are opportunities with some of the treatment processes to recover phosphorus, for instance, as a biological fertiliser. So, absolutely, we will be exploring, you know, the beneficial reuse of any of the components from the treatment plant. And equally, finally, we'll have a treated wastewater. There is always the opportunity potentially to use that within the vicinity of the plant, possibly to irrigate, you know, maybe some of the parks and gardens, you know, within the city to replace and displace potable water. So, absolutely, that's part of all of the options.
And also, just with some of the land options that are in here, is the cut and carry option of being able to sell that, and Rotorua Taupo do that, or spraying to trees and having a harvest income off that as well.
Question down here, if I may. I think we've probably got 10 or 15 minutes more before we wind up, so people can think about going home, but we've had a good question time. Sir.
Yeah, thank you and good evening. I was pleased the Mayor and the previous speaker mentioned Singapore. I'm impressed by their new water system that they have in Singapore. Is that system being considered by the team, or is it too expensive? Because it's very good.
It was one of the long list options, but it was excluded on the basis of both cost but also the acceptability of reintroducing treated wastewater into the water supply. So, yeah.
There's also a requirement within Singapore. They have a dual water system to all of the houses, so part of it would require a replumbing of large parts of the city, because it's just the difference in population density and structure within the city. And Singapore is, right back from the early 70s, was recycling its water. Most people didn't know.
Yeah, they have another set of pipes, the purple pipes, yep, which flow right throughout their city, so they treat it very much as a resource. Yeah.
It's the gold standard.
It is.
Yep, and they have a different financial structure as well, but we won't go there. Can I just see if there's someone else who hasn't had a question, and then I'll come back to you. There's a lady here who hasn't had a question.
My question is an observation. Rather than this consultation process, which has got this room full of fine people asking really great questions, it would have been good if this form that came out could have had the options in it, but that the question to the public was rather a values-based question, prioritising, for example, cost over the environment, over whatever the other values are, which people seem to be including in the emphasis, whether it's climate change or whatever it is here. And if people had that, that could be a first phase, which could help in the next phase, which where you would have developed the whole scenario further, because you would know the emphasis that the public were putting on these various aspects in relation to value. Because I think when you talk about, we don't, believe it or not, we don't necessarily want the cheapest option. I think it's becoming quite obvious that we do want the best option. And that's, everyone's got the best intentions here, no matter whether they can afford it or not. They still want the best. I get this this sense, and I know the council has the same sense, but it would be good if we could have done it that way around.
Thank you for that, and it definitely there's a values component in this decision making. Well, maybe we get your feedback and we'll be better off with it than not having it at all.
Sorry, David.
Anyone who hasn't had a question yet?
Oh, sorry, it's
Sasha.
Sasha from the council here. Just to your really good question there around values. There is some values-based questions on here on the last page. Which options do you prefer and why? What don't you like about the other options, and what matters to you most? And I think we're trying to draw out that conversation in those questions.
Thanks, Sasha. Where's Olivia? Is there any more coming in off Facebook or whatever on questions? Twitter, whatever. Can't see any. So a question here. Get the mic, sir.
Good evening. One of the questions I would have is 3 or 4 of the options. We have to secure large quantities of agricultural land. As this consent is meant to be processed in the hands of the Regional Council within 2 years, do you believe you've got the ability to have the land options also secured at entry of presenting your consents?
We won't actually have to own the land before the consent process is applied. We
I'm
just
not
have
talking
to.
about owning, but the ability to secure the land. It may be 4 or 5 years later than 2022 that you actually have to own it. But do you believe you have the ability to secure the land for the options?
We will have to be able to do that if that's the option, otherwise the consent won't be awarded because it's not a doable process.
That's my concern.
What's going to actually make you happy?
Your question, one down the back later. You come second. Down here first.
Actually, I was because I realised we were coming to the end. I just wanted to ask you, you've got a drop-in centre on call-in Friday. I've got a lot more questions, but I'm loving listening to other people. So are you going to have any experts there, say, this Friday, between whatever hours it is? It's a drop-in centre?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good, because I think a lot of people, I won't be alone in that. I mean, I'd like more clarification.
I think there's about another 8 drop-in centres and different sectors.
And the drop-in sessions are designed to have more of an intimate
Oh, I get
conversation.
that, yeah.
So
hey,
we'll
can
have more
I make
people to talk
one
to.
more comment
So
about
there will
the
be technical people
there's
there.
pamphlets going out. I actually personally rang the council. I don't know whether it was you dealt with. The lady said about not because people don't know junk mail or whatever. Having come from Auckland, any council paperwork went in the letterbox. So did the newspapers. And what I discovered was it's whoever you're employing to distribute through the lovely people that walk up and down the streets were telling them not to put them in the letterboxes with the no junk mail. So maybe there needs to be a bit of clarification on that, because I chased her up the street and said, where's mine?
Thank you. Yeah, we've got we've got that feedback from others. Thank you.
Having been on the other end of that conversation, I can tell you that that policy causes a lot of grief as well. So, down the back.
Just thought I'd ask some more questions from Facebook.
Yep.
Has the council consulted with the rangitane about the ways in which their roles as kaitiaki will be impacted by the various options?
You want to shoot on that one?
Yeah. Rangitane are heavily involved with our project in that they sit with us on the project steering group, which David chairs and we're all part of. I work directly with a number of their officers and they've been involved in a lot of the technical work that we've got underway, and they've really been driving some of the conversations and actually the output around what does a wetland or land passage look like. The effects on cultural values, etc., to date have been led by Rangitane. I think the council has a really positive relationship with them, which does filter through the process so far.
And just one more that's complete.
And sorry, they felt compromised being here today. Otherwise, they would have been here today, but they felt compromised.
Another one we've had a few times is how does it affect rural residents? Can you just explain that?
Well, if you're not connected to the network, it doesn't affect you.
So, are there any more questions? There's one right at the back.
Sir, I just said earlier that they would have been here, but they felt compromised.
You have a representative here. Okay? That's how Māori do things. Okay, this is just a question just to the council. But is the water supply under pressure? Is it? Because if it is, maybe it's the new subdivisions that use consented to allow to happen and put that extra pressure upon it. Now, when you give the consent, did you take into account the pressure it would be putting on our wastewater situation? Did you take that into consideration? Because what's happening is the people that have always paid rates are the ones that have to foot the bill after you gave the consent. Now, did you take it into consideration? This is just to the council, not to you, sir, just to the council, because they are the ones that passed the consent for the new subdivision. This is the question. Did you take into account this problem?
I'm unsure what you're talking about and which problem.
I think you do.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. Which subdivision?
The extra pressure being put onto our wastewater has come from these new subdivisions. Did the council get the consent for the new subdivisions? Did you take into account the pressure it would be putting onto our wastewater?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
Okay then, thank you, sir.
So can I just ask that with Rangatane, it was certainly invited.
Yes, and no representation.
Yep.
That's pretty sad.
Gentleman here, can we have a microphone down here, please?
Yeah, I just want to give you some kudos in that a local council nearby has spent the last 10, 15 years working on their plant without consent and have to keep upgrading it. At least you people are trying to get the consents before you start construction. So that is a big tick.
We'll take that one. We'll take that one.
We'll take that one. Thank you.
That's what my mother would have called being damned by faint praise. I'm just joking. Any other questions for anyone? Otherwise, I think we're going to wrap it up. Can I do 2 or 3 things in wrapping up? Firstly, I really want to thank you all for coming out tonight because everybody's busy and you don't need another night out. So we appreciate that. We appreciate your questions and your feedback and your comments. They are very helpful. They've been absorbed and they've been recorded. But can I encourage you to make a submission and put your thoughts down and feed it into the system? That's all laid out in the booklet. And get your friends and discuss it over whatever you do, a glass of wine, a beer, a barbecue. Get other people involved so that we actually get a good feel of the feedback from the community so that we can get a good process that's rigorous and inclusive of everybody so that as we go forward there's a sense of comfort that we're doing the right thing. It will be challenging, it will be conflicting. We will never have the perfect answer because a lot of these things are pulling in opposite directions, but at least we can address it with rigour and integrity. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panel.
And David,
Mayor can have a last say.
Thank you, David, and thanks for chairing this. I'd just like to acknowledge everybody that's come as well. The councillors and I will be around, and some of the officers will be around for another 10, 15 minutes. So if you'd like to speak to us, we're available. Thank you.
He's